There's a moment, and in every institution, in every family, in every power structure, there is always exactly one moment when the decision gets made. Not announced, not written down anywhere, just made. A look across a room, a conversation that ends 2 minutes too quickly, a name that stops appearing on certain invitation lists. For Meghan Markle, that moment came earlier than anyone has ever publicly admitted. And it wasn't triggered by the Oprah interview. It wasn't Megxit. It wasn't even the wedding. The palace made its decision about Meghan long before she and Harry packed their bags for California. And today, we're going to reconstruct exactly how that happened. I've spent weeks going through the sourced accounts, the biographies, the leaked correspondence, the on-record statements from former royal aides, the timelines buried in court documents from Harry's phone hacking case. I'm not here to tell you Meghan is a villain. I'm not here to tell you she's a victim. I'm here to show you the evidence and let you decide. Because the truth of what happened inside Buckingham Palace between 2017 and 2020 is more calculated, more institutional, and frankly more fascinating than any tabloid headline has ever captured. Think of this as a case file. We have a suspect, or depending on your view, a target. We have an institution with centuries of survival instinct baked into its walls. We have a timeline of events that, when you lay them out side by side, tell a story that nobody inside that institution once told clearly. So let's tell it clearly. Before we get into the evidence, let me set the scene. January 2018. Meghan and Harry have been engaged for 2 months. The public reaction is extraordinary, overwhelmingly positive, globally electric. Here is a biracial American actress, self-made, outspoken about feminism and social justice, marrying into the most scrutinized royal family on the planet. The press coverage is euphoric. The palace's public statements are warm. Harry looks happier than anyone has seen him in years. But here is the thing about institutions. What they show the world and what they actually think are almost never the same thing. While the world was celebrating this fairy tale, the machinery inside the palace was already running a very different calculation. And the people who were part of that machinery, the senior advisors, the private secretaries, the courtiers who have served the crown for decades, they were watching Meghan with a very specific kind of attention. Not the attention you give to someone you're welcoming, the attention you give to something you're not sure you can control. That distinction matters, because everything that follows, every leaked story, every aide who resigned, every closed door and cold shoulder, flows from that original assessment. And we have the receipts. In this video, we're going to go through 3 core pieces of evidence. 3 moments, 3 patterns, 3 documented turning points that together answer the question everyone keeps dancing around. When exactly did the palace decide Meghan had to go? By the end of this, you're going to have an answer, and it's going to be more specific than you expected. Let's open the case file. Let's start with the staff, because before any public drama, before any headline, before Harry and Meghan ever sat down with Oprah, the first signal always comes from the people who work closest to power. And in the case of Meghan Markle, the staff turnover inside Kensington Palace was not just unusual, it was, by any historical standard of the modern royal household, extraordinary. Here are the documented facts. Within the first year of Harry and Meghan setting up their joint household at Kensington Palace, they lost their personal assistant. Then a second personal assistant. Their communications secretary resigned. A senior aide who had worked with Harry for years left the role. By the time Meghan was 6 months pregnant with Archie, the couple had cycled through more senior staff than most royals go through in a decade. Now, and this is important, the palace never commented on any of these departures officially. That's standard. Royal households don't do exit interviews for the press. But here's what's not standard: the stories that came out anyway. Not from tabloids making things up, from people with names, on record, in 2 separate major biographies, Finding Freedom by Omid Scobie and Carolyn Durand, and later Endgame, also by Scobie, as well as Robert Lacey's Battle of Brothers. Multiple former aides described the same pattern. Emails sent at 5 a.m. Demands that were described as, quote, constantly shifting. A working environment one source called unsustainable. Another used the word impossible. These aren't anonymous internet rumors. These are sourced on record accounts from people who were physically inside that building. But here's where it gets interesting, because this is where the institutional calculation begins. The palace didn't just observe this turnover. Senior courtiers began documenting it. And when you understand how the royal household actually operates, when you understand that the private secretaries and senior advisors are not just support staff, they are the institutional memory of the monarchy. They are the people who have kept this family functioning through abdications and wars and divorces. When you understand their role, you realize something important. They don't document things casually. They document things when they are building a case. And the case was being built. There's a specific incident that crystallizes this. It happened in October 2018, during the royal tour of Australia and New Zealand. Publicly, the tour was a triumph. Meghan was pregnant, glowing. The crowds were enormous. The coverage was wall-to-wall positive. Privately, according to multiple sources cited in Battle of Brothers, tensions behind the scenes had reached a level that several senior staff members found deeply uncomfortable. The word used in one account is volcanic. Now, was this Meghan's fault entirely? Was it a culture clash between an American with a different working style and a centuries-old British institution allergic to change? Was it the impossible pressure of being the most scrutinized new royal in a generation, while also being pregnant? All of those things are probably partly true. But here's the cold institutional reality. It doesn't matter why. The palace doesn't do therapy. The palace doesn't run sensitivity workshops for its courtiers. The palace has one job: protect the institution. And when senior advisors looked at what was happening in the household of the second most prominent royal couple in Britain, they saw instability, unpredictability, a variable they could not model or manage. And institutions built on centuries of survival do not tolerate unmanageable variables. If you found this breakdown useful so far, if this is the kind of detailed, sourced analysis you don't usually find in royal coverage, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep doing exactly this kind of work. Okay, back to the case file. Because the staff situation was only the first crack, the second crack was bigger, and it involved not aides, not assistants, not private secretaries. It involved the press. Specifically, it involved the way the palace manages the press. And once you understand how that system works, an entire chapter of this story that seemed confusing suddenly becomes crystal clear. The British royal family has a relationship with the tabloid press that is, to put it diplomatically, complicated. For decades, there has existed an informal arrangement, never written down, never officially acknowledged, whereby the palace and the major tabloids operate on a kind of mutual non-aggression pact. The tabloids get access, get tip-offs, get the occasional exclusive. In return, certain stories don't get printed. Certain lines don't get crossed. It is transactional, it is cynical, and it works until someone disrupts it. Meghan disrupted it, not intentionally at first, but her very existence as a story, a biracial American actress, vocal about her values, deeply suspicious of the British press after watching what it did to Harry's mother, meant that the usual rules of engagement didn't apply. She wasn't going to play the game. She had said as much privately to people close to her, and the tabloids, particularly The Sun and the Daily Mail, noticed. What followed was a systematic negative press campaign that has since been partially documented in legal proceedings. Harry's lawsuit against news group newspapers, which resulted in a settlement and an apology, established that phone hacking and unlawful information gathering had been used against him. The implication for what was written about Meghan during this period is something many commentators have drawn, but the palace has never directly addressed. Here is what the palace did address: nothing. Publicly, officially, nothing. And that silence, that institutional silence in the face of a documented, coordinated press assault on a sitting member of the royal family was not accidental. Former communications staff have since indicated that the decision not to defend Meghan publicly was made at a senior level. It wasn't oversight, it was a choice. Think about what that means. The palace has defended its members from press attacks before. It defended Kate Middleton when topless photos were published in 2012. They issued a formal legal challenge within hours. But when Meghan was being subjected to what her own husband later described as a campaign of racial targeting and misinformation, the response from the same institution was a shrug. That asymmetry is not a small detail. That asymmetry is Exhibit A, because it tells us something precise about the institutional calculation that was already underway. The palace was not going to spend its political capital defending someone it had already, quietly, internally, begun to write off. The question is, when did that internal write-off actually happen? When did "this is a problem we're managing" become "this is a problem we're waiting to be rid of"? For that answer, we need to look at the second Ulika, the event that, once you examine it closely, changes everything about how you read the timeline. That's coming up next. And I promise you, the specific details of what happened are not what you've been told. The date is October 14th, 2018. Harry and Meghan have just returned from their Australian tour. Meghan's pregnancy has been announced. The public mood around the couple is still, broadly, positive. And on this particular Sunday, a story runs in the Mail on Sunday that, on the surface, seems relatively minor. A letter. A private, handwritten letter that Meghan had sent to her estranged father, Thomas Markle, in August of that year. 5 pages, handwritten, deeply personal. The kind of letter you write when you're trying to reach someone you've lost. Raw, emotional, private. The Mail on Sunday published substantial excerpts from it. Now, this becomes a legal case. Meghan sues. She wins. The judgment, handed down in February 2021 by Lord Justice Warby, is unambiguous. The Mail on Sunday had violated her copyright and her reasonable expectation of privacy. It is one of the most significant legal victories against the British tabloid in recent memory. Meghan wins, clearly and completely, in open court. But here is what the legal victory obscures. Here is what gets lost in the headlines about the ruling. In the months between the letter being published, October 2018, and the legal proceedings beginning, October 2019, Meghan was still a working member of the royal family. She was still attending official engagements, still representing the crown, still operating under the palace's communications umbrella. And during those 12 months, the palace's response to the ongoing press targeting of a sitting duchess was, once again, institutional silence. But this time, the silence was accompanied by something else, something more active. Something that, when you lay it next to the staff departures and the press dynamic we just discussed, starts to look less like negligence and more like strategy. In the weeks following the letter leak, sources close to Kensington Palace, not Clarence House, not Buckingham Palace, but Kensington Palace, where William and Kate's operation was headquartered alongside Harry and Meghan's at the time, began briefing journalists. Not on the record, not with names attached. But the briefings were real, they were happening, and they were not favorable to Meghan. This is documented, not by conspiracy theorists, by Dan Wootton, then at The Sun, by royal correspondents at the BBC, and most extensively by Omid Scobie, whose reporting, whatever you think of his editorial perspective, is sourced and has never been successfully legally challenged on its core factual claims. The briefings covered a range of narratives, that Meghan was difficult, that she had made Kate cry, a story that Meghan later directly contradicted under oath, stating the opposite had occurred, that she was demanding, unprofessional, unsuited to royal life. These narratives didn't emerge randomly. They emerged consistently, from the same geographic and institutional location, fed to the same cluster of royal correspondents at a time when the target of those narratives had no institutional mechanism to respond. Because that's the other thing nobody explains clearly enough. When you are a working royal, You cannot simply go on Twitter and say, "That's not true." You cannot call a press conference. You cannot give your side of the story. You are bound by protocols that were designed in a different era for a different kind of media landscape. You are, institutionally, silenced. So we have a duchess who is being legally violated by the press, briefed against by sources inside her own institution, unable to defend herself publicly, and receiving no institutional protection from the family whose name she now carries. Ask yourself this: at what point does that stop being an oversight and start being a message? I'd argue, and the evidence supports this, that the message was being sent from approximately November 2018 onward, and the person it was directed at understood it clearly. We know this because of what Harry said publicly in October 2019, when he and Meghan released a joint statement announcing legal action against multiple tabloids. The language Harry used was striking. He didn't speak in careful, palace-approved diplomatic terms. He spoke like a man who had spent a year watching his wife be destroyed and receiving no help from the institution he had served his entire life. He used the word ruthless. He referenced his mother directly. He said, and I'm quoting the actual statement here, "I lost my mother, and now I watch my wife falling victim to the same powerful forces." That statement was not approved by the palace communications team. Read that sentence again. That statement was not approved by the palace communications team. For a working royal to release an unapproved public statement of that nature, emotional, accusatory, referencing Diana, is not a small breach of protocol. It is a seismic one. And it tells us something crucial about what Harry believed by that point. That he could not trust the institution to speak for him. That he was, effectively, on his own. Now, here is the piece of this that most people miss entirely. The palace's response to that statement was not anger, not a formal rebuke, not a private dressing down that later leaked, as these things usually do. The response was, again, silence, followed by a very quiet, very deliberate series of logistical moves. In early 2019, it had already been announced that Harry and Meghan would be splitting their joint household with William and Kate, moving their operation to Frogmore Cottage, away from Kensington Palace. The official explanation was practical: more space, more privacy. And maybe that was part of it. But former staff members and royal commentators, including Roy Anika at the Sunday Times, have noted that the split also had the effect of separating Harry and Meghan's communications operation from William and Kate's, and crucially, from the senior advisors who had the most direct access to the monarch. In institutional terms, you are being moved to a quieter corridor, away from the center of power, away from the rooms where decisions get made. It's the kind of move that organizations make when they want to manage someone out without having the conversation directly. Every large institution does it. It rarely gets named, but everyone involved knows exactly what it means. And by mid-2019, Harry and Meghan knew what it meant. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep following this case file, because what comes next, the actual execution of the palace's decision, is where it gets truly remarkable. The mechanics of how an ancient institution removes one of its own members, that's part 4. And there's one specific meeting, one room, 4 people, and about 40 minutes that changes the entire story. That's next. January 13th, 2020. Sandringham Estate, Norfolk, England. Outside, it's a grey English winter. Inside, in one of the private rooms of the Queen's country residence, 4 people sit down together. Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Charles, Prince William, Prince Harry. No spouses, no communications advisors, no private secretaries in the room. Just the 4 of them, and everything that had been building for 2 years. This meeting, which has since been referred to simply as the Sandringham Summit, lasted approximately 90 minutes. Harry arrived having already published 4 days earlier a statement announcing that he and Meghan intended to step back as senior royals, split their time between the UK and North America, and become financially independent. He published that statement without palace approval, without warning, without even giving the Queen advance notice. The palace's public response to the announcement was, by royal standards, almost shockingly direct. The official statement said that discussions were at an early stage and that the issues were complicated. For people fluent in royal communication, that language was the equivalent of a 5-alarm fire. But here's what the Sandringham summit actually reveals about our central question. Because most coverage focuses on what Harry wanted and what the family offered, that's not what interests me here. What interests me is the speed and the precision of what happened after that meeting. Within 1 week of the summit, the full terms of Harry and Meghan's exit had been finalized. 1 week. An institution that takes months to decide the color of a ceremonial uniform resolved the most complex constitutional status question involving a senior royal in decades, in 7 days. That speed is not normal, and it is not accidental. It tells us that the framework for this exit had already been prepared. The logistical, financial, and constitutional terms of removing Harry and Meghan from working royal status did not get drafted in 7 days. That kind of institutional documentation takes weeks, sometimes months, under normal circumstances. The fact that it was ready, that it could be finalized in a week, means the work had been done in advance. Contingency planning, at minimum. Quite possibly something more deliberate than contingency. The palace had a plan ready. They were waiting for a trigger. Harry's unauthorized January 8 statement gave them the trigger they needed. Now let's talk about the specific terms, because the details of the exit arrangement tell us a great deal about the institutional calculation. Harry and Meghan were required to drop their HRH styles for working purposes, not stripped of the titles, but effectively sidelined. They lost access to the sovereign grant funding. They lost their publicly funded security arrangements in the UK, a point that became deeply contentious and eventually the subject of legal proceedings when Harry's security was not reinstated during visits to Britain. They were required to step back from all official royal duties. Every single one of these terms had a dual function. On the surface, they were the logical consequences of choosing not to be working royals. But institutionally, each one served a specific purpose: to make return difficult, to reduce Harry and Meghan's ability to operate as a parallel royal brand, and to limit the reputational risk to the crown of anything Harry and Meghan might say or do going forward. This is sophisticated institutional architecture. You don't build it in a week. You don't build it in response to a surprise announcement. You build it when you've decided, at some prior point, that this outcome is where things are heading. There's another detail here that almost nobody has discussed in enough depth. In the weeks immediately following the summit, the palace's communications team, the same team that had spent 18 months not defending Meghan from press attacks, became suddenly remarkably active. Briefings went out to royal correspondents with a very specific framing: that the palace had been patient, that every effort had been made to accommodate Harry and Meghan, that the door remained open, that Harry had made his choice. The narrative was constructed with care and speed. Compare that to the 18 months of silence that preceded it, and the contrast is jarring. The institution went from publicly saying nothing to publicly saying quite a lot, but only once the exit was in motion, only once the outcome was secured. That is not the communications behavior of an institution reacting to a crisis. That is the communications behavior of an institution that has been waiting patiently to shape the story it always knew it would eventually need to tell. And then came the interview. March 7, 2021. Harry and Meghan sit down with Oprah Winfrey. The broadcast reaches 49 million viewers across the US and UK in its first week alone. Meghan discusses her mental health struggles inside the institution. She says she was told by a palace official that no help would be provided. She discusses a conversation about the potential skin color of their unborn child, a claim the palace responded to with carefully constructed ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying the details, while saying it would be addressed privately. The palace's formal response to the interview was a single paragraph, 13 lines. After 2 hours of television, in which a former working duchess described suicidal ideation and institutional abandonment, 13 lines. And crucially, the palace did not dispute the core claim that requests for mental health support had been denied. They disputed the characterization of conversations about Archie's skin color, attributing it to recollections that may vary. But the mental health claim, the most damning institutional failure described in the entire interview, received no direct rebuttal. That silence, in that context, is not a small thing. If the claim were false, if there were documented evidence that mental health support had been offered and Meghan had refused it, or that the account was fabricated, an institution with the palace's legal and communications resources would have said so. Clearly, immediately. They have the receipts for everything. They are the most document-heavy household in Britain. If the receipts existed, those receipts would have appeared. They didn't appear, because they didn't exist. What we are left with, when you piece together the staff departures, the press briefings, the legal abandonment, the Sandringham terms, and the interview response, is a picture that is uncomfortable but coherent. An institution that identified Meghan as a threat to its operating model decided, quietly, without announcement, as institutions always do, that the situation was unresolvable, and then spent 18 months creating the conditions for an exit while maintaining the public posture of welcome. It is not moustache-twirling villainy. It is not a conspiracy. It is something more mundane and in some ways more troubling. It is an ancient institution doing what ancient institutions do, protecting itself, removing the variable it couldn't control, moving forward. And if you're wondering whether any of the key players have ever acknowledged this reading of events, whether anyone inside that institution has ever quietly confirmed that the decision was made earlier than anyone admits, stay with me, because the final piece of this case file, the verdict, contains one detail that I haven't seen discussed anywhere else, and it reframes everything. That's the final chapter, coming up right now. So here is where we are. We have 5 staff members gone in 12 months. We have a press operation actively briefing against a sitting duchess from inside her own institution. We have a legal assault on her private correspondence met with institutional silence. We have a household physically relocated away from the center of power. We have an exit framework finalized in 7 days, because it was already built. We have a 13-line response to the most damaging interview in modern royal history, a response that pointedly did not deny the most serious claim in it. That is the case file. And when you lay it out like this, sequentially, sourced, without the noise of competing tabloid narratives, the answer to our central question becomes less like a theory and more like a conclusion. The palace made its decision about Meghan Markle in late 2018. Not 2020. Not after Megxit. Not after Oprah. Late 2018. Somewhere in the window between the Australian tour in October and the end of that year, the institutional assessment shifted. She stopped being a variable to be managed and became a variable to be removed. Everything after that point, every briefing, every silence, every logistical reshuffle, was the execution of a decision that had already been made. Now here is the detail I mentioned, the one I haven't seen discussed elsewhere.
In November 2022, Harry and Meghan's Netflix documentary series dropped. In the opening episode, there is a moment, brief, easy to miss if you're watching casually, where Harry describes the period after the Australian tour as the moment he realized the institution was not going to protect his family. Not the Oprah interview preparation, not Megxit, not any of the events of 2020. The Australian tour, October 2018. He doesn't elaborate extensively, he moves on. The documentary has bigger set pieces, more dramatic moments, and that particular line doesn't get clipped and distributed the way others do. But it's there, and it matters. Because it means that Harry's internal timeline, his own sense of when the relationship with the institution became irreparable, matches almost exactly the timeline that the documentary evidence points to independently. Staff departures escalating through late 2018. Press briefings beginning in earnest through late 2018. The household separation formalized in early 2019.
Harry's unapproved press statement in October 2019, exactly 1 year after the Australian tour, reading in retrospect like a man who had spent 12 months trying to find another path and had finally accepted there wasn't one. The institution decided in late 2018. Harry accepted it in late 2019. The world found out in January 2020. That gap, that 14-month gap between the decision and the announcement, is the most revealing thing in this entire story. It tells you that both sides spent over a year in a kind of institutional limbo, each waiting for the other to make the move that would force the endgame. The palace waiting for Harry to break protocol badly enough to justify the terms they already had prepared. Harry waiting for some gesture, some signal, some evidence that the institution was capable of changing. Neither side got what they were waiting for.
Both sides got exactly what the evidence had always suggested they would get. Now, I want to be honest with you about what this analysis does and doesn't prove. It doesn't prove malice. Institutions don't require malice to behave badly. They require only the survival instinct and the absence of accountability. Both of those things the British monarchy has in extraordinary abundance. It doesn't prove that Meghan was without fault in any of this. The evidence doesn't speak to that question one way or another, and I'm not going to pretend it does. And it doesn't prove that the palace's internal conversations were as calculated and deliberate as the pattern of their behavior suggests. We don't have transcripts of those rooms. We have outcomes. We have timelines. We have the gap between what was said publicly and what the evidence shows privately. But here's what I will say, as someone who has spent a significant amount of time in this case file. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. And the speed of that post-Sandringham exit framework is, to me, the single most telling detail in the entire story. You do not finalize complex constitutional arrangements in 7 days unless the work was already done. Full stop. The decision was made in late 2018. The rest was paperwork. And that leaves us with the question that I think is genuinely worth sitting with. Not as a gotcha, not as a conspiracy, but as a serious question about what kind of institution the monarchy actually is in the 21st century. If the palace had decided before any of the public drama, before Oprah, before Netflix, before any of it, if they had decided in late 2018 that Meghan was incompatible with the institution, what would a different response have looked like? What would it have meant to actually try? To defend her publicly from press targeting? To provide the mental health support she asked for? To use the institutional weight of the crown to push back against a documented campaign of misinformation? To treat her, in short, the way they treated Kate when topless photographs appeared? What would have happened if they had? We don't know. We can't know. But I'd argue that question, what a genuine attempt at inclusion would have looked like, and why the institution was apparently unwilling or unable to make it, is the more interesting question than anything about Meghan's personality or Harry's choices. Because those are questions about individuals, and individuals leave. Institutions remain. The British monarchy has survived the Black Death, the English Civil War, 2 world wars, the abdication of Edward VIII, and the death of Diana. It will survive Harry and Meghan. It has already survived Harry and Meghan. But survival and integrity are not the same thing. An institution can endure and still be worth examining. Can still be worth asking, in this case, in this moment, with this woman, did you do the right thing? I'll let you answer that in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land on this. Whether you think the palace had no choice, whether you think Meghan made it impossible, or whether you think something else entirely happened that I've missed in this case file. That conversation in the comments is always the best part of these videos. If this kind of deep, sourced analysis is what you come here for, if you want the full case file rather than the headline, subscribe, hit the bell, because the next video in this series goes somewhere that will genuinely surprise you. We're looking at the one person in this entire story who has never spoken publicly, who was in every critical room, and whose silence may be the most eloquent testimony of all. The case file stays open.